Congratulations, you all found the nicest looking room in the Tulane in this area. Congratulations also, you are here on the year that comics invaded the bookfest, the New Orleans Bookfest at Tulane University. If you were at the Atlantic monthly seminars, 2 comics made it onto their great American novels of the last 100 years. Alan Moore's Watchmen, a book written by 2 British guys, and also Will Eisner's amazing Contract with God, which I think I was really happy to see that one on the list. So if you ever get the chance to do a deep dive into New Orleans comics and cartoons from the last 125 years, you might join me in the conclusion that we are really in an absolutely golden era of New Orleans cartooning. I think there's 2 reasons for that. One is that, to its credit, the local daily newspaper, unlike many daily newspapers, has not abandoned political cartooning and instead, absolutely worth calling up. And the other is that the alternative press is doing its job and bringing new faces, new ideas, new cartoonists into the forefront. And here is where I do my shout out to a man you should all know. And if you go to T-Rex Parade, you'll see him, Cesar Meadows, who is the comics editor of Anti-Gravity. They have a comics editor. And I know was important for two of my panelists here. So I also, by the way, I had this all printed out, and I think I left it in the General Petraeus panel sitting on my floor. So if he picks it up, we might have a very strange battle coming up in the next time. But today we have, and then the other reason I think we are in this golden era is because we have cartoonists like the 3 that I'm very, very, very lucky to be here with today. 3, I think, very different approaches, 3 very different set bodies of work. This is why I don't do this. This is why, okay. I now am doing like a screenshot by mistake of my notes here. Just 1 second. Discard changes. Okay, I'm back. So anyway, I was saying these people are great, which I don't need to read off this. But they are very different, but they have some very interesting similarities. For example, Kyle Bravo and Kate Lacour, to my immediate left, have both backgrounds in punk rock and indie comics. Kate Lacour and Walt Handelsman, to your far left and center left, both studied art therapy, went to school for art therapy. This is like the band introduction. I haven't introduced the band, but really the band is introducing themselves to each other here. And then both Walt Handelsman and Kyle Bravo are musicians as well as cartoonists. But of course, what most binds them together is that they are that breed called New Orleans cartoonists. They are telling stories with words and pictures in the place that Walt has called a cartoonist paradise, which is a name that I blatantly stole for the name of this panel. So thank you, Walt. So given that we have 3 people here, I'm going to stop talking, and this is going to, I basically see myself as kind of the world's best server at Creole Creamery, trying to offer you up some really great teaspoons of this work. All of these artists you'll be able to find. Of course, Walt, you can pick up the paper and see. Kate's got an extremely good website that gives you a sense of the breadth of her work. And Kyle, you can pick up in any New Yorker or Anti-Gravity or elsewhere. So let me give you a little bio for each one. Kyle Bravo is a cartoonist whose work has been featured in the New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, and Anti-Gravity magazine. He has self-published an autobiographical comic series, Forever and Everything. About his comics, cartoonist Noah Van Sciver, one of my favorites, has said, Kyle's comics have a distinct goodness to them. And I completely agree to that. His panel comics are laugh-out-loud funny, both when they are for national audiences or when they are hyper-local. And I believe the silences that are in Kyle's autobiographical comics have more heart and content than a page full of words. So that's Kyle. Walt Handelsman is our 2-time Pulitzer Prize winning editorial cartoonist for the Times-Picayune and The Advocate. His work is nationally syndicated to more than 200 newspapers. In 2006, Walt decided to teach himself Flash animation, and in 2007 became the first person to win a Pulitzer Prize for animation. Walt has 9 collections of his editorial cartoonist in book form, as well as a children's book. So I personally find Walt's comics to be very much like I find Walt himself, to be very cheerful and very affable, but beneath that cheer and that affability, you find someone who's very unafraid to say truths, no matter how unpopular they might be. We'll get to that later. Kate Lacour, when I did that study of New Orleans cartoonists in the last 125 years, the first time I got to a woman cartoonist working in New Orleans was when I got to Kate Lacour, something else we could talk about later. But she is a cartoonist, illustrator, and taxidermist, focusing on visionary anatomy. To me, the incredible drawing seen in her absolutely essential Fantagraphics book, Vivisectionary, read kind of like Rube Goldberg drawings of whimsy, horror, myth, and science, and more than anything, death and sex and regeneration. My experience with that book is I pick it up off my shelf, I read it, I'm amazed by the illustrations, then I become kind of frightened of them, I put it back on my shelf, and then I repeat that process over and over and over again. So I'm going to start some getting to know you questions, first of all. And the first one is, and you all can jump in. By the way, if you all want to just ignore me, like the panelists on Carson when they start to have their own conversation on the couch, if you want to ignore me and ask each other questions, and we will have question and answer. If anybody wants to clear their throat or raise their hand and jump in throughout the panel, that'd be fine too, because this is cartooning and we can be a little less formal.
I think it gets a little chaotic.
Okay, so Kate Lacour is requesting chaos. So in that realm, what is the first thing that I'll start with you, Kate. What's the first thing that you remember drawing that sticks with you from your childhood or creating artistically?
Great question. I can't remember a first, but I can remember a very strong visual experience that I think's informed everything I've drawn or sculpted or made afterwards, and definitely informed my book. And that's, I had a book about the human body when I was little. It was a children's version of the illustrations of Fritz Kahn. So they were kind of, Fritz Kahn does these very elaborate, almost mechanical anatomy diagrams. And I had a child's version of that. And there was a fold-out section where you could see all the systems of the human body. And the musculature system horrified me because he had these naked teeth, naked eyes, which gave him a very expression, a very abject expression, and then he was flayed. And so I would slide it off my bookshelf and look at it, and it was wonderful, but it was so awful I could only look for a little bit, and I'd have to slide it back. Sometimes I would make myself, even though I didn't want to, take it down and take a look. And I did regular kids' drawings, but you ever have like secret drawings when you're a kid where you're exploring something that scares you, a dream, a worry, whatever. I did a lot of very, very crude schematic drawings that related to my ambivalence about that body that wasn't in pain. It was education. It was informational. It was the calmest, driest, most diagrammatic thing, and yet it looked so viscerally awful.
In Vivisectionary, you also talk about dioramas
Yes.
being, and museum dioramas, which was kind of a later iteration of dioramas.
Yeah, very much so.
And you talked about something I see in your book, which is that it's kind of where science meets magic.
I think so. The dioramas that I experienced were at the American Natural History Museum in New York City, which is really amazing. It's just world-class taxidermy and some really historical pieces. But those kind of tableaus encased in glass were also really popular to have in people's homes and in non-scientific ways. Sometimes it would just represent a bird in a beautiful position, maybe something exotic, like a bird of paradise that you would never have in your life. have encountered, and then they would be posed in these very fanciful ways. So it was instructive in institutions, but then also was something that people would have to create a fantasy space within their homes. You could have a tableau of a marmoset drinking out of a mango blossom or something, and that could be in your parlor. And I love the idea of an enclosed world that's static, that's completely posed and artificial, but that is meant to evoke a feeling of a snapshot, and that you can take it out anytime and enter into it like it was a dream or a memory that would be always the same. And that's like a built environment that's built around a certain feeling that you want to capture.
Walt, do you remember your first doodle or beautiful, fully realized Walt Handelsman cartoon when you were 4 years old?
I did a lot of, doodling in my school books, which was a problem later when it came time to graduate, but it worked out well for me in the long run. I also used to draw cartoons for my classmates in like 5th and 6th grade, making fun of teachers and various things like that. And I did a series of cartoons about my orthodontist, who I could not stand. So those were early cartoons that I can remember. I think the first cartoon I can remember that was actual, like a standalone cartoon, was a guy eating spaghetti. He's sucking the spaghetti down. There's a big pile of spaghetti, and as the panels go by, the pile goes down, and then the line of the table goes down, and then all that's left is him sitting at a chair. So that was like the first one where I'm like, that's an actual cartoon. And
Do you remember how old you were when you did your spaghetti drawing?
Probably 12 or 13.
Uh-huh.
And it wasn't until later when I started working. Well, I did some cartooning in college that was pretty bad, but it was fine. It was an opening, and they were printed in the newspaper. So, but I really didn't really have the discipline to do the kind of cartooning I do now until I was maybe 17, 18, 19, where you're thinking of an idea first. What do you want to say? And you have to come up with a punchline rather than I spent many years drawing faces and little goofy things. And it wasn't until later when I realized whether it's a gag cartoon or an editorial cartoon, you have to have a punchline or a visual gag. And so I went away from just drawing like faces that were fun to draw and started thinking about what did I want to say in the cartoon. And so I drew my first cartoons when I was probably just out of college. I had a job in advertising at an ad agency, which I found not very inspirational in terms of the creativity part. I was doing paste up and layout. But I would go home every night, and I told myself, you have to draw a cartoon every day. And they were huge. They were like this big. And this was the beginning of the Reagan administration. So this was like right before, in 1980. And they were terrible. I mean, they were fine because I was drawing them, and I was like using a paintbrush and dipping it into a bottle of ink. And they were huge, and I still have them, but they weren't very good. But it was the beginning of trying to figure out how to express myself about politics and social stuff. So that's kind of how it began.
Kyle, what was your spaghetti?
So yeah, I didn't, like a lot of cartoonists drew a lot when they were kids, and I didn't. I always was really into just creativity, making stuff, doing creative things, building stuff with Legos and stuff like that. But I do remember kind of elementary school time, I figured out this way to like draw these mazes, and I think I got this like validation. Like my mom was like, oh, that's cool. And it's like, oh, validation. Now, let me do more of this, you know? And so that's definitely one of my earliest experiences. And I think I've kind of been chasing that ever since. You know, I want to make stuff that then people respond to in some way. But I really didn't get into drawing until much later in life, like I'm doing now.
And when was that? And what sparked
depends
that?
what you count as it, I guess. I mean, like kind of teenage years, I still wasn't really, I didn't think of myself as like a visual artist. I played music and I skateboarded, and like those were kind of creative outlets. In college, I studied graphic design. For a long time, I thought of myself as a printmaker. I still do. I love screen printing and things like that. And then, so yeah, I existed more in kind of the art world, gallery world for a long time. And then about 8 or 9 years ago, started drawing comics pretty, basically daily. I got really into it, and that became my focus.
Walt touched on something that I want to bring up later, but first I want to ask you this question. It's kind of two questions. You can choose to answer whichever one you wish, or both. And that is, could you name a cartoonist that you have found to be particularly influential on you as a person, as an artist? And can you name New Orleans or Louisiana anything that you found has influenced your work, whether it's a Louisiana idea, an artist, a writer, a tree, a pet, whatever, anything that has either one of those questions resonate with any of you. Take it whoever wants to.
I can go.
Okay.
I mean, for me, Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, when I discovered that in like my early 20s, it just like blew my mind. It made me understand comics just in a totally different way. I think before I just thought it was like superheroes and stuff, and it wasn't that interesting to me. But to think of it in more of a formal way, of like these sequential images that can tell a story and different ways of looking at that was really powerful. And I think it stuck in my brain, even though at the time I wasn't drawing comics. It just like stuck in my head, and it was coming out in different ways in my printmaking and things, these sequential images. But yeah, it's very influential. Yeah.
Okay.
For me, I had seen comics when I was younger, but just superhero stuff, and I thought, this is a male power fantasy thing. This is very boring. But then in the 90s, there was, mostly from Fantagraphics, Drawn and Quarterly to Kitchen Sink, there were a few publishers that were putting out mini comics. I mean, it's the floppy comics, like the size of the superhero ones, that were mass distributed, so you could go to your local comic shop and pick them up. And that was mind-blowing for me. Graphic novels really rule the day now, but for $4, $3, you could go pick up just these amazing punk comics that were going in all different directions. And there were women making those too as well. So I didn't feel, this scene was exclusive. At least that's not how I perceived it as a, teenage consumer of this stuff. So then, as a practitioner, to get picked up by Fantagraphics, which was so influential in the 90s in redefining how comics are perceived, or their work in the 90s has led a lot to the tidal wave, the tidal shift in terms of how they're perceived nowadays as being, an art form. That was really, really gratifying for me, of course. I don't feel like there's an institution down here that's inspirational apart from Caesar in the same way, but I feel like the Gulf Coast's energy really speaks to my particular brand of cartooning, at least, the way it's so full of fertility and decay and chaos and color and stink. It's all just such a pungent mess. And so full of life and the messiness of life that, as you were saying, Kyle, about like creativity, not just within comics, but it's very inspirational to be living in a city where there's so much creativity all the time, and that a lot of it is kind of creativity for the sake of creativity. We're going to throw this party and we're all going to make these costumes out of it and we're all going to show up and there's no point. It's just cool.
Did I read or hear, I think in an interview maybe with Gil, that you made sweatshirts out of Daniel Clow's drawings, or with a Sharpie or something like that early on?
Yeah.
Daniel Clow's, if you also the movie Ghost World, that's based on his comics, but kind of a legendary alt comics figure.
Those and Chris Ware's first books had come out, and so I was drawing Quimby the Mouse on my dad's old undershirts because there was no Hot Topics. If I wanted punk clothing, I had to make it. And I guess that was my perception of what punk clothing was.
In the 1960s, Bunny Matthews was doing Rat Fink drawings on T-shirts and selling them to his friends in school. So there's a long tradition in that, locally at least. Walt, how about you?
I think, like so many other cartoonists of my generation, I was inspired early on by Mad Magazine, particularly, Don Martin, and just the whole Mad Magazine was irreverent and well-drawn, and it was just awesome. And everyone I knew got it, and we all loved it. And in terms of political cartooning, when I was quite young, my parents gave me a Herb Block book. So I grew up in Baltimore, and he was at the Washington Post, and I just was fascinated with it. And then a little later than that, Pat Oliphant came onto the scene. And to my memory, Pat Oliphant was the first political cartoonist that was funny. Like, he was biting, and he was an incredible artist. But he used humor more than Herb Block did. And, back in the day, a lot of cartoons, not so much Herb Block's, but around the country, were like a charcoal drawing of like Uncle Sam's arm and an eagle. And Oliphant took that to a whole other level and drew these amazing, almost Mad Magazine-esque looking cartoons with these great caricatures and biting commentary. And then from that came the school of like Jeff McNelly, who was a god in the cartooning world for guys my age, who was only about 10 years older than us, but he was brilliant and was very funny and just a wonderful artist. And Mike Peters, who still draws cartoons, who is extremely funny, humor-based. And that has been a big thing in the cartooning world when there were several hundred cartoonists, and there was always a divide between the guys like in my generation were like Rob Rogers and Mike Lukovich and myself and maybe 10 other people of our age. We all started around the same time in the late 80s, mid 80s. And we were funny. Like, our goal was to, be tough, but also use humor and draw the audience in with humor and then make a point. And others were not funny. And it was a question of, could they be funny? They didn't want to. That was their point, was a different way. So, and in terms of New Orleans, I would say I've looked at John Chase's books, and his stuff was amazing. And obviously Bunny Matthews and such. But to me, the thing that inspires me is really like the people and the vibe of New Orleans. And now that I'm back in New Orleans for over 10 years now with the Advocate, that's now the Picayune, and it's gone full circle. The work that I do is wider. So because the paper's in Baton Rouge and Lafayette, so I don't focus quite as much as I did back in the day just on New Orleans. And so it's a different feel. But I do feel like the people in New Orleans and in Louisiana in the bigger picture are a certain way. And this, I won't go too long, but this is shown in this caption contest that I do. So I did this caption contest when I was at Newsday in New York, which had hundreds of thousands of circulation. And I would do a caption contest, and we would get like, at the most, 80 or 100 entries. I started doing it here, and like the first time we did it, there were like 300 entries. And I'm like, what in the world is going on here? But it's actually what I expected, because people here are funny. And more importantly, they're not afraid to be funny. Like like everyone's a character here. And so you give them something to draw, a punchline to put in, and they'll send you in all kinds of stuff every week. And so that is what I try and capture when I just draw regular people. It's like, what are these people actually like? And the city and the saints and the flooding and the politics, it's all part of a piece, sort of writes itself in many ways.
Well, you mentioned political cartoonists being funny, and that's something I wanted to ask you about. Your work reminds me in a certain way of Charles Schulz, the creator of Peanuts, in this way. By the way, I will always be jealous that you got to spend quality time with Charles Schulz. If nothing else, besides your talents and everything else, that's just always going to get under my skin.
Michael came into my house, and I said to him, I want to show you something. I guess we had been back a couple of years, and I said, I want to show you. And I went and got a box, and it's flat, and in the box was an original Peanuts. And it was folded in, like, it had been folded when it was sent to me, because it's like this big, and it was folded in between two panels. And he's like, why isn't that framed? And what in the hell is going on here? That thing's worth thousands of dollars. And I'm like, I don't know, I have so much artwork. And so I did frame it, and Michael explained to me how important that one was.
Thank you very much.
I knew Charles Schulz is a god in cartooning, but I didn't realize the stuff about having Snoopy in a cartoon and the cloud cartoons and whatever. So
well, he said one time that he remembers that one of his primary jobs, and he has to remember that, is to draw funny pictures. And in your work, when you open up the paper and you see the image at first, I don't know if it's going to be a funny picture of a guy who's gone into the refrigerated section at a grocery store because he's trying to get to the air conditioning, or whether it's going to be, about gun violence.
And I don't either, because my script is what's going on in the news.
Yeah.
But occasionally I'll feel like, I know my job, some people call it a political cartoonist, but most of us now, and for years I've called it an editorial cartoonist, so you editorialize on everything. And occasionally I'll take a little Post-it note and stick it on the bottom of my computer and just write, "Be funny." And sometimes you can't be funny. I mean, these days, it's extremely difficult. For years and years and years, basically everything I did on politics, people found funny. Whether you were on one side or the other, you could admit that was funny, whoever did this. That's over. And so, when there's an opportunity, I'll give you an example from this week. I'll give you an example from years ago when I was at Newsday, and there was a story that came out. I opened up it was on the front page. Threesome happens on the Long Island Railroad in front of people, and I'm like, no reason to read the rest of the newspaper. There's no way I'm not doing a cartoon about that, which I did, and it was very funny. It was all the stops from New York to my house, and they were all changed. The names were changed with sexual references that could get into the newspaper. But this week, I opened up the paper. Actually, I saw it online, and it said that these rats had gotten stoned at the NOPD, and I'm like, job's done.
Yeah.
And, maybe, I think for me, I love that. I love the opportunity to get away from the back and forth of politics every day and do something that I know everyone is laughing about. Everyone is thinking about that. It's insane. It's funny. And so I drew them, getting all the food out of the vending machine and sitting on the ground. They're all have the munchies, and a cop's looking in there saying, "Why is the vending machine keep being empty?" So, and I got to draw the police chief. So, I mean, that's a nice break. But, I do cartoons that half the people think are funny many times, but I'm sure the other half of people don't. But that's the way it goes. That's the politics that we have these days. But I do try and use humor more than, as you said, I've done a lot of cartoons about gun violence, about climate, about bad decisions by politicians. They're not funny. Hopefully they're pithy or mean-spirited, hard-hitting.
Kyle Bravo, I haven't told you this, but I did a PowerPoint of the Historic New Orleans collection about New Orleans cartooning. And the cartoon, and 125 years of cartooning that got the biggest laugh from that crowd was just a simple drawing of a front page of the local newspaper that said, "Louisiana gives up New Orleans for Lent." See? So I'd like to ask you about the muscles that you flexed doing your microcomics, your autobiographical comics, which are still available online, and I'm going to find out now if you're ever thinking you might return to them or not. And then your shift to the kind of comics that are more akin to what Walt is talking about. One is very granular. It's about literally two people at a table and what passes between them, and the other is much more of a presentation with a punchline.
I think whether it's like the gag cartoons for like New Yorker style more recently, or the autobio comics and the little zines and stuff, I think they're all, first of all, I do want them to be funny, but also a little more about kind of just like getting at this, just like sort of fundamental truths of like, what does it mean? What's it like to be alive? Like these human experiences that we all have. So I feel like, and I'm trying to get at that through humor, but I think that's kind of what ties some of the overview of my work together. But yeah, I've gotten away from the autobio comics and comics really. I haven't really done much comics, the difference between like a single panel gag cartoon versus like comics, which is multiple images in a row. Because I just sort of got obsessed with gag cartoons in the last few years, and it's just this whole. There's some overlap with comics, but it's also it's very much its own thing as well. And there's very much these like, almost like these formulas of trying to figure out like how does this work, where you have one image and one caption, and somehow you're also like kind of leaving something out that the viewer has to sort of figure out in their brain themselves. And that just seems like magic to me, and I've just kind of like become obsessed with like trying to do that as well as I can. So that's what I've been up to lately, but. I feel like I have been thinking more and more. I'd like to get back. It's just a matter of time. I don't have a lot of time to do it, but to get back to the auto buy or a little more comic stuff. So I'll probably get back eventually. Yeah.
Kyle also brings you into that process through your Patreon, which I encourage. Of course, Patreon is any field of art a way to keep that art that you like going. But often you will, even your first cartoon to hit the New Yorker, that went through so many iterations and so many just slight tone differences in the language for whatever it was, 12, 14 word caption. Can you talk a little bit about that experience of editing, re-editing, and revising?
Yeah, in some ways, I mean, I come up with an idea, and most of them are terrible. So that's a big part of the editing. It's just like you come up with 100 ideas, and like, you know, then you narrow that down to 10 that are decent, and then, you know, eventually draw a few of those, and then I just keep doing that, you know, every day. Every day. I've in the last year or so, I committed to like I'm just going to draw one cartoon a day every day, and that's when things really started to happen. Is when you just do it all the time. But as far as editing goes, like, yeah, I mean, one word can make the difference between something being funny or not. You get like the right word or the right order of the words. Even in the drawings, like, it's such a fine line. Like with New Yorker kind of cartoons, you don't want to be too outrageous with like gesture or expression. There's a certain subtlety to them, but you can't be too subtle because you do need, you know, hands and faces and just the simplest little line of like the way the tilt of a mouth can show so much about someone's emotion. So I'm always trying to kind of figure out that balance of like just subtle enough, but just showing just enough to give the viewer where they can then kind of figure out the rest to get the joke.
Right. Yeah, I saw an interview that Pauline Kael did with Clint Eastwood one time, and he talked about the importance of not showing the guy running around the house, but showing him in one part of the house, the other part, and giving the viewer the chance to connect those two images.
And I mean that's the basic idea of closure, like, and that was probably one of the things that most blew my mind when I read Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, is the idea of like the gutter, right? There's like a panel, and then there's the gutter of like space in between, and the viewer figures out what happens between those two still images. And in a gag cartoon, it's the same way. You've got a caption and an image, and you're sort of leaving the rest up to the viewer to kind of do 1 + 1 = 4 or something like that, you know.
Kate, I mean, you mess with that form quite a bit in your work, but the one time is almost a departure because it's sort of a more traditional autobiographical comic. Was your Cartoonist journal you did? You can still see it on the Comics Journal. So that's a 5-part series, I think, something like that.
Yeah, that's an ongoing thing they have, where a different cartoonist will just write the story of their day for 5 days. And I had never shown myself in comics before, and I got around that by always just showing like the back of my head or my feet or something, or, you know, from my perspective, because that felt uncomfortable to draw myself. I've also done more traditional storytelling, you know, panel, filling up the page with like a linear narrative. In some mini comics and in some comics I did for Anti-Gravity about harm reduction in the opioid scene. But for my work that's most recognized, the book Vivisectionary, and what's been the most fun for me to do is to look at diagrams and see how when they're showing, you know, the frog laying the eggs, the tadpole with legs, the froglet, when those progressions, it's like in Scott McCloud's book, it's static item, static item, static item, and it's the viewer that connects those and says, this is a story, something is happening, something is changing. And I liked the idea of telling a story in a way that seemed explanatory, but that was also confusing because it's not quite possible to thread each of those pearls together on a real string. And I was also inspired by, in the days in, I guess, the Renaissance and stuff, in religious paintings, there would often be your altarpiece, and then running underneath there'd be like a story from the life of Christ or something, or a parable that would be told panel by panel somebody's with the birds, and then the wheat, and then the shepherd, and it would tell the story without words because literacy. And I loved the idea that one thing is happening visually, but that something else is happening that tells a piece of the story that you wouldn't know otherwise. George Huron does that in Crazy Cat, where there's and then there's a big story up here, and then there's a little something happening on the bottom that's a little extra, and it relates, but it's what do they have to do with each other? I like giving more room for the reader because they usually come up with something that's much better and more meaningful to them, and often in general, than what I had in my mind when I laid it all out.
We've got a little time bomb down here telling us that we've gone over the time. By the way, a lot of people give shout outs to the sponsors and the organizers, and of course, I'm so happy to be part of the New Orleans Book Festival, but I also want to give a shout out to Faith Dawson-Simmons, one of the great journalists of our city, and who's also working this room and making this happen.
We have time for a few questions.
We have time for questions. Yeah. We have time for questions.
If you raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic.
Sir.
Pardon.
Be interested to know what your favorite or most memorable single narrative and image is that comes to mind that you're most proud of. If you can single out one of many, of course.
By the way, we're not over time for the panel. I was just saying I'd hit the time we had to hit questions. So anyway, make the crowd scatter. But yeah.
I've drawn a lot. I've drawn, 15,000 cartoons, but I know Michael likes two of them we both agree on. I did one sequential cartoon about gun violence, which would probably be too complicated to explain. But I did one about Jazz Fest years ago. I think it was in '94. And it said, May 1st, 1994, 12 o'clock, everyone met everyone else at the flagpole. And it's an aerial view of Jazz Fest. It's all empty, but there's a ginormous circular crowd around this little flagpole. So that's like, I did one about Tipitina's when the casinos opened here in the 90s, and someone's saying, do you think the casinos will change New Orleans? And the other guy saying, Wayne Newton's playing at Tipitina's tonight. And it turned out that the guy that eventually bought Tipitina's called me when I was in New York, and he said, I just want to let you know, I bought Tipitina's because of your cartoon. And I'm like, first of all, who are you? And what are you talking about? And it turned out that he didn't realize how important Tipitina's was to the city. But when he saw it in the cartoon, he said, wow, that must be a place that people know about, which I thought was...
Saved it because of you.
I don't know if he saved it. He's no longer with us, but it was an interesting story.
Kyle, something you're particularly proud of, you feel really good about, that you do?
There's so many cartoons I've drawn that I love that not everyone else apparently does because they haven't gone anywhere. But I guess I would just say the one that my first cartoon in the New Yorker, which was because that was just like a dream come true to have that happen. And so basically, it's a couple in a living room, and they're looking at their phones, and the man says, according to my phone, society's on the brink of collapse, but according to our living room, everything seems pretty much okay, or something like that.
And that drawing kind of sat with you for a long time, right? That's one of those process
Right.
things.
Yeah.
You had
So,
that drawing kind of...
I came up with the idea and I drew it, but I sat on it for a little bit because I thought I had others that were funnier and better, and so I didn't submit it right away. And eventually, it ended up in one of my batches that I send in. But it's kind of like at the end of the batch, I just thought I'd throw it in, and then that's the one they chose. So it's kind of I guess shows what I know. I guess I don't always know what's good.
Can I just give him a shout out?
Yeah.
Because he just had a cartoon in the New Yorker. We just met, but I see his stuff on Facebook. And the cartoon he just did, tell him the cartoon he did about daylight savings time.
Oh,
I thought that
a
was
pisser.
brilliant.
Yeah, that
That
took
was
me
a great
minute, which is
cartoon.
what you want.
It's hard to remember my own cartoons. Let's see. So there's this the kind of trope of like this chalkboard, big blackboard with like this crazy equation on it, math equation or whatever, science equation, and there's a sort of scientist-looking guy there saying to someone next to him, Wait, is that
That's
the
not
leap day
it.
one?
That's not a
Talking
courtroom
about the
scene.
one in the-
Sorry, that was the leap day cartoon.
The courtroom. Where were you?
I'll tell the cartoon. This great cartoonist that I know did this cartoon. So he's got
We all
this
know.
courtroom scene, and there's a guy on the witness stand, there's a judge, and there's an attorney, and the attorney is pointing at the guy on the witness stand, and he's saying, bear in mind now, it was daylight savings time, and he's saying, where were you between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m.? So this is one of those ones, as the reader, you're like, why is that funny? And then you're like, oh, there was no time between 2 and 3 a.m. That was a great cartoon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kate, did we get to you about your favorite? Not
My
yet.
favorite
Yeah.
is the one I'm going to draw after this, about the time that the three cartoonists were sitting with this other cartoonist who couldn't remember his best cartoon that everybody else knew.
I'm on the
The
spot.
audience had seen it. They were all cutting up.
That
He
other
was so
cartoon,
embarrassed.
I remember that one too, was also great with the math,
Yeah.
the guy
Yeah.
on the board, and he's saying, and then something like, and then you add in the leap year or something about,
It's this big equation they've been working on, and then he's like, but then to make it all work, we had an extra day in February.
great stuff.
I've got probably time for another question. Yes. In back. While the mic's going over there, I can tell that gun control cartoon in about a couple seconds. It's called That Blank Feeling, and it's a newscaster saying this many people blank were killed. People said they don't understand blank, and it's just over and over and over again that newscaster gives that, and it was just a real feeling like this. It captured the idea without telling us the idea that we are stuck in a cycle and we got to find our way out. And
It's always the same news.
it's always the same news.
Blank amount of people killed, blank place. Witnesses don't know how blank got this, and,
Yeah.
you know.
Yes.
Hi, so this question is more for Walt because you touched on this a little bit. So you talked about getting inspiration from cities in Louisiana that are not New Orleans, like Lafayette and Baton Rouge, and I'm from Lafayette, so I was just curious to know what kind of things like inspired you and what charm that you feel like you found there.
Well, we've been to Lafayette, my wife and I, a few times. We really like it. And so I would say I haven't really drawn too many political cartoons about the goings-on in Lafayette, but I have drawn several caption contests that are involved in like the Bayou scene, the music scene there. And I get a ton of people sending in their captions from Lafayette, including several winners. So there's, I don't know,
Cajun folks are funny.
they're super nice, and we go down there and eat, and I've done a couple of presentations down there. They're well attended, and people come up and say, oh, you know, I send my stuff into your cartoon caption contest. So it's just so different because my first stint in New Orleans for 13 years was in New Orleans, and everything was about either national stuff for my syndication or hyper New Orleans stuff. And so when I came back, you know, that's not the job anymore. There's still a big focus on New Orleans, but lots of stuff about the legislature and the state in and of itself. So
I have a couple quick announcements before we thank our panelists. First of all, I want to shout out to my co-author on a new biography of Bunny Matthews, and a treasury of his work that Historic New Orleans Collection is putting out. We'll be going right back to work on this as soon as this panel's over, but Allison Fensterstock, my co-author, is here. It's been a real thrill. Second of all, as part of the Cartoonist Invade, the Book Festival 2024, tomorrow, one of my favorite graphic memoirs of the last ever drawn. It's called The Best We Can Do by Thi Bui, about her parents' experience as Vietnamese immigrants. And she is in conversation, I think probably leading the conversation with Viet Nguyen tomorrow morning. And I highly recommend that and her work. As I do, 5 seconds, Patreon for you. Your website leads people really well. And Walt, pick up the damn paper, but also find your books as well in local bookstores.
and the website, NOLA.com.
And the website, NOLA.com.
Facebook.
Ladies and gentlemen, the golden era of New Orleans cartooning.
Thank you so much.